In 1993, Pepsi handed you a bottle with nothing to hide, or at least that was the idea. You could see straight through the liquid because there was no dark syrup or murky caramel color, just a crystal clear cola that looked cleaner than anything else on the shelf. The massive ad campaign borrowed the music of Van Halen and the visual language of Mountain Springs to create a shorthand for purity. But if you actually flip that bottle over to read the label, the ingredients told a much more complicated story. We have to ask why clear suddenly meant pure back then, and more importantly, who decided it did. To understand how a transparent soda convinced millions of people it was somehow healthier, you have to look at what was happening in American culture during the early 90s. The Cold War had just ended, and there was a real sense that the heavy, industrial world was finally giving way to something lighter and more modern. You could see that feeling everywhere, from interior design to the grocery aisle, as consumers started to distrust artificial colors and additives. This shift in public opinion was being turned into a marketing selling point faster than the actual science could keep up. Filtered water was transitioning from a niche novelty into a standard household item, and the word natural started appearing on labels for products that had not changed their formulas in years. For over a century, the color brown had been the gold standard for cola, but it suddenly carried a kind of visual baggage it never had before. Pepsi's internal research teams picked up on this cultural change and reached a very straightforward conclusion. They believed that if color signaled contamination to the modern shopper, then removing that color would signal the exact opposite. Before Pepsi made their big move, a much quieter brand had already proved that this concept could work in the real world. Clearly, Canadian was a sparkling water company that built a massive following through the late 80s by selling clear, lightly flavored drinks in those distinctively shaped glass bottles. They were not trying to replace your favorite cola, and they usually stayed in a different part of the store next to the juices and the expensive waters. Because they never made aggressive health claims and simply looked clean, they sold well enough to get the attention of the biggest players in the industry. Crystal Pepsi eventually launched in test markets in 1992 before going national in 1993 with a campaign that felt almost philosophical. That famous Van Halen ad was not really selling a soda as much as it was selling a specific moment in time, where the future felt uncomplicated. The imagery focused on open skies and rushing water to give you the general feeling that something new was beginning. Yet not one frame of that commercial told you what was actually inside the bottle. Coke watched all of this happen and made a cold, calculated decision that their chief marketing officer, Sergio Zyman, later described with surprising honesty. They did not even try to compete by making a better clear soda. Instead, they built Tab Clear as a kamikaze product meant to crash the entire market. By associating Crystal Pepsi with the mediocrity of Tab Clear, they ensured that when Tab Clear disappeared, Pepsi's version looked like a dying trend instead of a standalone success. This was the cutthroat landscape Crystal Pepsi was trying to navigate before it ever had a real chance to live or die on its own merits. If you looked at that clear bottle back in the 90s, you might have assumed the recipe was simpler than a standard cola. The reality was exactly the opposite. While the marketing suggested a cleaner product, the chemistry inside was actually more complex than what you would find in a traditional can of Pepsi. The formula still relied on a heavy mix of citric acid, phosphoric acid, and a blend of sweeteners to get that signature soda bite. They did remove the caffeine, which was a legitimate selling point for parents and health-conscious shoppers, but the biggest change was stripping away the caramel color. Most of us think of food coloring as a purely cosmetic choice, but in a cola, that brown tint is doing a lot of heavy lifting behind the scenes. Caramel actually interacts with the flavor compounds to create a specific mouthfeel, and it also serves as a vital UV blocker that prevents the drink from breaking down under harsh grocery store lights. When you take that out, you are not left with a simpler drink, and instead you have a product that requires a whole new level of chemical engineering to fix what the color was doing for free. To make up for the missing caramel, chemists had to add various flavor modifiers to mimic the original texture and taste. This meant the ingredient list did not actually get shorter. It just shifted toward more processed additives to keep the drink stable. It is a strange chemical irony that the more they tried to make the soda look pure, the more artificial the production process actually became. This lack of protection led to a massive problem with shelf stability because, without that dark pigment to block out the light, Crystal Pepsi started to degrade the moment it hit the shelf. Aspartame was used in several of the test versions, and we know now that this sweetener breaks down much faster when it is exposed to light in an acidic environment. By the time a customer grabbed a bottle from a convenience store cooler, the liquid inside was not the same product that had left the factory weeks earlier. The biggest hurdle for consumers was not the science of ultraviolet degradation, but rather the confusing signal their brains received when they took that first sip. You would pick up a bottle that looked exactly like water or a light lemon lime soda, but the flavor hitting your tongue was unmistakably a heavy cola. When your eyes see one thing and your taste buds report another, your brain does not just get confused, it registers the experience as fundamentally wrong. Food scientists often call this the uncanny valley of flavor, where a product is just close enough to something familiar to trigger an expectation, but different enough to feel like a mistake. Things got even worse when Coca-Cola released Tab Clear, a product designed specifically to be mediocre so it would drag the entire category down. Because the two drinks hit the market at the same time, shoppers couldn't tell the difference between a premium launch and a corporate hit job. Before Crystal Pepsi could even finish its first year on the market, the entire concept of clear soda started to feel like a cheap gimmick, while the strange taste was a major setback. It might not have killed the brand if the logistics behind the scenes had been more reliable. Most new products need a little time to find their footing. But Crystal Pepsi did not have that luxury, because its sensitivity to light meant it had a much shorter shelf life than its competitors. A standard bottle of Pepsi can sit under fluorescent lights for months without the flavor changing at all. But Crystal Pepsi would start to drift almost immediately. This meant that grocery store managers had to watch their stock much more closely and pull older bottles off the shelf far sooner than they wanted to. For a brand new drink that did not have a loyal following yet, the high cost of spoilage made it a very difficult sell for retailers who were just looking at the bottom line. By 1994, Pepsi tried to save the brand by reformulating it with a splash of lemon, hoping to bridge the gap between the clear look and the heavy cola taste. They likely thought this would make the drink feel more refreshing, but the move actually signaled to the public that the company had lost faith in the original idea. When a brand changes its recipe that quickly, it rarely looks like an improvement, and instead it feels like a desperate attempt to fix a sinking ship. When Coca-Cola finally pulled Tab Clear from the shelves, it served as a final public verdict on the entire clear soda experiment. Retailers and distributors saw the exit of a major player as a sign that the market had spoken and that the format was a failure. Tab Clear's disappearance did not leave more room for Crystal Pepsi to grow. Rather, it framed the drink as the last survivor of a trend that everyone else had already moved on from. If you look at Clearly Canadian, you can see why that brand managed to stick around much longer than the clear colas did. They never tried to pretend they were a cola alternative, and they did not rely on the same confusing marketing about purity and health. Their bottles sat next to juice and sparkling water, where a clear liquid made sense. They faded away slowly due to normal market shifts, rather than a sudden collapse. The whole clear beverage craze of the 90s taught us a lot about the promises of a product's appearance versus what it actually delivers. Brands like Snapple rode that same wave of natural marketing, But the market eventually corrected itself when people realized the packaging was doing all the work. Consumers were not rejecting the idea of better ingredients, but they were definitely tired of products that used transparency as a mask for more processing. When Pepsi brought the drink back for limited runs in 2015 and 2016, the massive wave of interest told a very specific story about nostalgia. People lined up to buy it again because they wanted to recapture a feeling from their youth, not because they actually liked the flavor of the soda. Once the novelty wore off and the memories were satisfied, demand disappeared, proving that Crystal Pepsi was always more of a time capsule than a beverage. By the time 1993 rolled around, the clearest soda on the shelf actually required more chemical tricks than the dark cola it was meant to replace. This was not some strange accident. Making a drink look like it contains nothing at all is an expensive and complicated process. Crystal Pepsi did not fail because people hated the idea of transparency, but because that transparency was only a marketing costume and not a true product. If you want more food history that looks past the label, subscribe and share this with anyone who still remembers that first clear sip.